Explore the past, present, and future of the Great Plains with hands-on, interactive exhibits for all ages. Learn about the people, the places, and the things that make up the Great Plains by watching a show in the auditorium, stopping by the outdoor trading post, or braving through the Terrible Tuesday Tornado Theater. Schools, active military, and senior citizens can also come to enjoy the museum for a discounted price. Visit the primary tourist attraction in all of Southwest Oklahoma, the Museum of the Great Plains.
Oklahoma Life TV proudly presents Historically Speaking, brought to you by the Museum of the Great Plains. We're in the grounds of the Museum of the Great Plains, located in Lawton, Oklahoma, rediscovering our roots. It's our story, it's our history. Welcome to Historically Speaking. We start off the infancy of this state and the Frank James connection in Southwest Oklahoma with historian Roy Young.
Today we're going to be talking about Frank James in Oklahoma. Now, who was Frank James? Frank is the older brother of Jesse James. Someone says, well, why did Jesse get all the publicity and Frank so little? Well, there's something about the name Jesse James that has a ring to it, and he was a little more rambunctious of the two brothers. But Frank is the brother who came and settled in Oklahoma in the early 1900s. So we're going to talk about Frank today, and then at the end we'll talk a little bit more about Jesse. Frank's name actually was Alexander Franklin James. He was born in 1843 in Clay County, Missouri, and after a period of time with Quantrill's guerrillas in the Civil War, he became upset with a situation that developed in Missouri that we're going to give some extensive background on. He married Annie Ralston in October of 1874. I say married, we've never found a record of it, but they lived together as man and wife until Frank's death. The couple lived their first years of marriage in Nashville, Tennessee. Why? Frank was still on the run. Jesse was still alive. Both men were wanted men. And they lived under the name of Ben and Fanny Woodson. And what's interesting about the name Woodson is that was their grandmother's surname. In fact, Jesse's middle name is Jesse Woodson James. So when Frank and Annie went to Nashville, trying to be on what we might call the lam, they used the name Ben and Fanny. Then after 7 years in Tennessee, they returned to Missouri and lived there almost 3 decades, 1881 to 1907. And it was in 1907 that the couple moved to Oklahoma, where they remained 5 years in the Fletcher area before finally moving back to Kearney, Missouri, where Frank died in 1915. Annie lived a long life after that, not dying until 1944 at Excelsior Springs at the age of 91. Frank and Annie had only one son, Robert Franklin James, and he lived until 1959. And he was born in Nashville while the parents were on the lam, and he was raised as a Woodson, though his name was Robert Franklin James. And he saw service in the Spanish-American War in 1898 and 1899, and he and neither of his two wives ever had any children. So that line of the James family came to an end. Frank James was in and out of Oklahoma numerous times in the 1890s. One article in the El Reno newspaper, the Oklahoma Herald, announced that Frank was there with Bill Dalton. Now, the name Dalton may be familiar to you because of the famous Dalton Gang. And Frank James and Bill Dalton met as their trains were passing, and they had gotten off at the depot in Guthrie, Oklahoma, which at that time was the territorial capital. And the two men went on from there to Dallas, where they decided they would make arrangements to open a saloon during the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. So those two outlaws became partners in that enterprise. Many of the old-time outlaws ended up, oddly, in being performers. Most of our listeners will be familiar with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and how he incorporated Wild Bill Hickok and others into some of his melodramas. Well, Frank James also got involved in some melodramas, but he went into it almost kicking and screaming that he did not want to do that. But on one occasion, he was enticed and finally said, "No, I have too much respect for myself to appear in the role of a train robber." And so over the next several years, stories kept coming up that Frank was going to appear in a play, something about the James boys of Missouri. And one time he even filed an injunction in court to get the promoters to stop using his name. But eventually he did sign a contract with a Pittsburgh production company to appear as himself for 30 weeks in what he finally said looked like to be a first-class play. In the spring of 1902, Frank had been confined to bed for several weeks, and interestingly, it was in that year that the first exhumation of his brother Jesse James was scheduled to take place. But Jesse James Jr., of course the son of Jesse and his wife Z, and some near relatives heard about what was taking place and went out to the original graveside at the James farm, dug up his father, Jesse, took the still dressed skeleton and what was left of the casket to the Baptist Cemetery in Kearney, Missouri, where he is buried today. Actually, Jesse's been exhumed 2 times, buried 3 times, exhumed 2 times, and the funny thing was that in this situation with Frank sick in bed, his mother decided that she was going to go get a look at her dead son, and Frank got out of his sick bed to prohibit her from doing that. In the next year, Frank and Cole Younger, you may be familiar with that name, the James Younger Gang is often what this group is known as. Cole Younger and Frank James decided that they were going to start their own Wild West show. But rather than start from scratch, they found one named Buckskin Bill's Wild West Show that they were able to buy out. And for the next 2.5 years, they operated under the name of Cole Younger and Frank James Historical Wild West Show. And that show toured throughout much of the South and the Midwest, with stops in Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, and other states. But this joint venture began to get them down. They were tired, they were worn out, the travel was more than they wanted to deal with, and so they were able to sell out. But that was the day of the very popular Wild West shows, and while they were successful, as they were aging, it just became too much for them. One thing Frank did like to do was be the starter for horse races, and he did that a number of times in places in Oklahoma. His first one was in 1904 when he was the starter for the horse race at Pond Creek, Oklahoma. And I found a very interesting article about that, because some people were surprised that an outlaw such as Frank James was being honored to the extent of being a starter for the horse race. Let me share this piece out of the Pond Creek News from June of 1904. We can see some logic in the position taken by those who favor the presence of this ex-outlaw. James is now, all concede, a law-abiding citizen, and we can probably impress upon the minds of the younger set the fact that all this honor rendered him is for James the honest man and not James the outlaw. And we must miss no opportunity to impress this fact on the young minds, else they will get things wrong in too and go home thinking that maybe they too can become famous and earn $50 a day by merely holding up a bank or two. So that's the attitude that the editor of the Pond Creek News had in regard to Frank James coming to that town. Later in 1904, Frank agreed to perform in a play called The Fatal Scar, said to be a humorous drama despite the name. Frank's part was actually small, and he did not even appear until the final act, but he was given such a grand build-up in the publicity and interviews that he was able to draw quite a crowd because of his name and the fact that he would be present and acting and participating. One of their stops was Oklahoma City, and the Daily Oklahoman on January 21st, 1905 said that Frank would be available at the Overholser Opera House in Oklahoma City on January 27th. Well, that took place, and though Frank was somewhat of a poor actor, just the fact that he was there and people could see him and touch him and ask for his autograph seemed to be enough. Now let's talk about Frank moving to Oklahoma, because there's a lot of controversy about that, and most people seem to think or have imagined that the reason he was coming to Oklahoma was because he and Jesse had buried a lot of gold from their train robberies and bank robberies. But as I'm going to share with you over the next few minutes, Frank was not at all coming to Oklahoma to find and dig up buried treasure. He was simply wanting to get out of Missouri because of some bad situations that had taken place there, in part with the survivors of the Confederate Army, Quantrill's band, and something that took place at a reunion that really disturbed him. The genesis of Frank coming to Oklahoma can be traced back to a speech that he made at one of the reunions of Quantrill's guerrillas at Independence, Missouri. And I want to share a little bit of this news article with you because it explains so much about Frank's feelings about all that had transpired during his years as a member of Quantrill's band, his years as an outlaw, and his years running from the law. The Sarcoxy record shares this with us. Frank James, ex-Confederate and lifelong Democrat at Independence, in his address to the surviving members of Quantrill's band, the most daring of their kind in the Confederate Army, exploded a political bombshell which all but disrupted the meeting. For not only did the ex-bandit renounce allegiance to the Democratic Party, but to his own native state as well. Declarations that were considered by the grizzled, war-scarred veterans are a little less than treason. And had not some of his less excitable friends forcibly pushed him from the crowd into the courthouse yard in Independence, it might have been the scene of a conflict recalling border days. It has been known among his friends that since the Missouri legislature some 4 years ago refused to elect James as doorkeeper of the lower house, he has carried the soreness of defeat deep in his heart. Not until Saturday, however, has he publicly exposed his hurt. Holding his hand high above his head, as is his custom when delivering a remark born of anger, he shouted to his old-time Quantrill followers, "I have been in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and other states we learned to hate because they gave birth to the federal troops we hated so well, and their people have treated me like a man. But here in Missouri, among my own people, I am unhonored and unsung. So why should I not turn to the belief of the people who have, in my declining years, proved my friends? I'm an ex-Confederate and a guerrilla, boys," he shouted, "but I'm no longer a Democrat. This year I voted the straight Republican Party from Roosevelt down the line, the same as the people will vote it who have been my friends in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and other states." Well, this, you can imagine, aroused the ire of his Confederate veteran friends, those members of Quantrill's old band, and they were so upset that they had to carry him out or rush him out, escort him out, because he was going to be attacked, as some of these old boys were wont to do. It was at this reunion where they were going to have a new election of officers, and Frank was running for the office of captain, and he would not be mollycoddled by his comrades to have some lower office. They had decided they might make him a sergeant at arms or a lieutenant, and he would have none of that. If he couldn't be captain, he wasn't going to be anything at all. Interestingly, the next year, an article appeared in the Kansas City Times which said, this year Frank James did not come to the reunion, and he would not have been welcome if he had. You see, they were so upset, as all of them were Democrats, all of them were grizzled veterans, and for Frank to give up not only on the Democrats but the state of Missouri had really risen their ire. So it was at this time that Frank and Annie began talking about leaving their native state of Missouri and moving somewhere. And Frank had had his eye on Oklahoma for a number of years. And in March of 1905, he and Annie decided to make a trip into Oklahoma and visit some of the communities, towns of which they were aware. And their first two stops were Broken Arrow and Muskogee, towns just south of Tulsa. Of course, the newspapers back in those days were about the only media, and they were able to get hold of the news that Frank James was coming. And a newspaper article headlined, Frank James coming, the ex-bandit to locate in Indian Territory. Of course, you see, this was before Oklahoma became a state in 1907, still considered to be Indian Territory. Well, Frank and Annie spent 3 days in Broken Arrow, said to be looking for farmland, and he was quoted as saying, the last time I was here was in 1863. Now remember, this is 1905. He says, I crossed the Verdigris River near the town of Catoosa and came southwest through the valley where Broken Arrow is now located. Ever since that time, I've been desirous of owning a farm in that vicinity and spending my last days in peace and quiet. So you see, his first idea was not to come and find some buried gold from days of yore. He was simply looking for peace and quiet, and if something around Catoosa or Broken Arrow south of Tulsa could be found, that was going to be good for Frank. Soon Frank and Annie decided, yes, we're coming to Oklahoma. Let's get serious about it. During this time, their son Robert had been living and working in the vicinity of Cement, Oklahoma, in Caddo County. He had been working there as a commission agent, and so he invited his mom and dad, Frank and Annie, down to Cement to look over that territory, which their son Robert considered to be a prime target for his mom and dad to settle. 2 weeks later, we find Frank and Annie in Fletcher, Oklahoma, where that newspaper reported that Frank and his wife were in our city yesterday. Mr. James is the noted Frank James that was with Quantrill during the Civil War and afterwards abandoned until 1882, when he surrendered to the authorities of Missouri. Mr. James is thinking seriously of locating in Oklahoma, and he's very favorably impressed with Fletcher and this section of Oklahoma, and will likely locate at this place. Well, Broken Arrow and Catoosa thought he was going to settle there. Now he's in Fletcher, and they think he's going to settle there. But 4 days later, he goes to Shawnee and begins visiting friends and old comrades there and looking over the area around Shawnee. And that local newspaper said, Mr. James expects to locate in Oklahoma and may decide on Shawnee, as he is well pleased with the city. The reason I'm putting emphasis on this is the number of people who think that he finally came to Fletcher to look for buried gold. Well, Fletcher was not his first choice, not his second choice. It was on down the line, and it was his son Robert living at Cement that really cemented the idea of Frank and Annie coming to Fletcher. Frank and Annie were in and out of Fletcher then over the next several months, but they found a suitable hotel in Chickasha and stayed there the entire winter, giving Frank a good opportunity to do some hunting. He loved to hunt quail and dove, and he spent much of the winter in the Chickasha area doing just that. But then came an opportunity for Frank to bid on some farmland in what was called the Indian Pasture Reserve northwest of Fletcher, just inside the southern border of Caddo County. And on November 9th, 1906, one of the Lawton newspapers announced that Frank was seen in that city with a companion, driving a two-horse buggy, and, quote, bidding a few friends goodbye on the fly, and drove out of town under the whip. And just as the buggy rounded the curve of 5th Street in Lawton, just east of the courthouse, James doffed his big white sombrero so that his long gray locks fluttered in the breeze, and he gave the old rebel yell, as in days of old. Well, as it happened, the Indian Pasture Reserve was being opened for bidding, and people from all over the United States were coming to the area around Lawton, both north, south, east, and west of Lawton, in hopes of being able to be successful bidders on pasture land. On December 29, 1906, an Associated Press wire went out from Lawton under the headline, "His bid rejected. Frank James, the noted outlaw, failed to get an Oklahoma farm." Well, digging into this, it turned out that he had simply made some technical errors in the paperwork, which resulted in his bid being rejected. The interviewer wrote that Frank had come west to begin life over again, and that having his son Robert nearby in cement has been one of the special delights of his life. The article concluded saying, Frank James wanted a farm in the new country on which to raise fine horses and hogs, and to experiment with several cereals that have not heretofore been grown here. And of course, by cereals, they're talking about crops that could be converted into foodstuffs. Frank did all that it was necessary to do to correct the paperwork, and he was awarded 160 acres, a quarter section of land in Pasture 2 in Caddo County. His bid was for $2,777, amounting to about $17 per acre. Wouldn't that be great to find land for that price today? So with his bid now being accepted, Frank continued to live in the area, but this time they decided to settle in cement until he was granted permission to take possession of the land. So that is what he did, made cement his stomping grounds for the next several months, with his son Robert living there and working as a commission agent. Going back to Missouri, Frank and Annie, with Robert and his wife along, made the move from Missouri starting on October 13th. And it was a 30-day plus cross-country journey to their adopted home in Caddo County. Now, I emphasize Caddo County because I live in Caddo County. Fletcher's in Comanche County, but Frank's farm sat on the north side of the Comanche-Caddo County line. So Frank was a resident of Caddo County. As they came along their way from Missouri, a number of newspapers became aware that that's Frank James leading that contingent of wagons. And as they stopped in Hennessy, Oklahoma, the Press-Democrat noted that the four travelers were camped near their town. The article said, "It's interesting to note that while at one time Frank James was a noted outlaw, he is now the best of men, a good citizen. He is a man of good appearance and shrinks from the notoriety which his former life gave him. His is an example of a changed life." Well, from there, the family moved on and they reached Fletcher on Thanksgiving Day of 1907. And that is just a few days after Oklahoma had become a state. They rented rooms in Fletcher, rooms in which they remained until the next spring. Construction on their little house started in December, and at the same time several outbuildings on the farm, as he wanted to be ready to go right to work. I found an interesting story by someone who was friends and acquaintances with Frank and Annie and Fletcher. Mrs. Dilling, D-I-L-L-I-N-G. Her husband was the local banker in Fletcher, and she later told a story that is quite humorous about how Frank mistrusted banks. Well, I wonder why. Because he had been a bank robber, I guess. And even though her husband, the banker, Mr. Dilling, had tried to convince Frank to deposit your money in my bank, the Fletcher State Bank, Frank was reluctant to do so. But finally, one day he came into the bank with a roll of bills, which beyond doubt he had previously buried in the ground because there was dirt all over them. Now, is that fact or fiction? Is that a story or a legend? Or did Mrs. Dilling really have the hit the nail on the head with that story? It's not that Frank was finding buried treasure. It's that he was burying his money on his own farm because he just didn't trust banks. Now, the Lawton Constitution was the major newspaper in the area at this time, and they were keeping up with Frank because he was news. And in April 1908, the Lawton Constitution carried a glowing report of the work Frank was doing in his new occupation as farmer. It says, quote, "You should see how Frank James is improving his farm. He brought with him from Missouri 2 pair of 16-hand mules, and despite the fact that he is 60 years old, he gets about like a boy and manages these 4-year-old mules to the disc, lister, or whatever it may be." Other newspaper articles from that era that I read talked about the great job Frank was doing, and one said he should be regarded as the champion farmer of the big pasture. So Frank and Annie are settled into their new home 2.5 miles northwest of Fletcher. They're happy, they're contented, they're attending the Presbyterian church, they're making friends, they're being invited to parties, they're hosting parties, and Frank is continuing to receive invitations to be the starter of horse races. In July of 1908, he was at Shawnee. In August, he was at Comanche, Oklahoma, and subsequently at the Oklahoma State Fair in Oklahoma City. I'm sure that these events provided Frank a little extra income, and probably he enjoyed a little degree of notoriety.
We'll continue with the Frank James story in Oklahoma with historian Roy Young on Historically Speaking. Next time, we'll take a personal trip out to Frank James's home.
Explore the past, present, and future of the Great Plains with hands-on, interactive exhibits for all ages. Learn about the people, the places, and the things that make up the Great Plains by watching a show in the auditorium, stopping by the outdoor trading post, or braving through the terrible Tuesday Tornado Theater. Schools, active military, and senior citizens can also come to enjoy the museum for a discounted price. Visit the primary tourist attraction in all of Southwest Oklahoma, the Museum of the Great Plains.